there are high risks that a nuclear power plant or a radiological facility could be hit, causing a dispersal of material.
Hi, and welcome to GAO's Watchdog Report, your source for fact-based, nonpartisan news and information from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I'm your host, Holly Hobbs. Under harsh conflict conditions, Ukrainians have struggled to operate nuclear power plants and to secure nuclear and radioactive materials from potentially falling into the wrong hands. As part of the United States' aid to Ukraine, Congress approved millions of dollars to help Ukrainians address these nuclear security and safety issues. We'll learn more about these efforts and the potential fraud risks to U.S. assistance from GAO's Allison Bawden. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Allison, maybe we can start with how serious of an issue is this? What's the concern here?
Well, it's a very serious issue because the consequences of a nuclear or radiological incident in Ukraine are so serious. There have been, over the years, some instances of kind of nuclear saber rattling from Russia with respect to the potential for low-yield nuclear weapons use. But really what's concerning is the potential for either an intentional or unintentional event at a nuclear power plant or a radiological facility that would cause material dispersal. There are about 35 facilities in Ukraine that have nuclear or radiological material, and there have been damage to some of those facilities since the beginning of the war. Just last week, there was reporting in the media about gunfire and drone sightings near the Zaporizhzhia power plant, for example.
So what's all being done about this issue, and how is the U.S. helping?
So the U.S. has a long history of supporting nuclear and radiological security in Ukraine. But as the war progressed, the U.S. really stepped up its support through supplemental appropriations from the Congress. And between about February 2022 and December 2023, the Department of Energy alone spent about $161 million on these efforts. Other departments also provided support. But the support, especially from DOE or Department of Energy, really falls in sort of three buckets. You can think of them as prevention, detection, and response. So for prevention work, which is really what was going on in the Ukraine before any of the hostilities, there was work going on to, for example, install radiation portal monitors at the country's border to detect any material that might have been illicitly on the move. Since the war, prevention has increased, for example, by installing those types of monitors more in the interior of the country. But also there's been a lot of focus on detection and particularly response. So response includes training, specialized training for Ukrainian teams to respond to a nuclear or radiological incident in the hopes of minimizing consequences.
So you hinted at this even before the war started, the U.S. has been helping Ukraine with security. How has that effort changed since the war?
So before the war, a lot of the focus was on that prevention. And this was work and is work that the United States had done in Ukraine and other former Soviet states, as well as in Russia, through the 90s and early 2000s. There is now, since the hostilities began, a greater focus on detection and response. So in detection, that might be things like remote sensing to understand whether an event has occurred. And then in response, really to train Ukrainian responders to address an incident if one happened.
There are plans to eventually transition the responsibility that some of the U.S. agencies are taking to Ukraine. What are those plans?
Well, some efforts that the U.S. has been undertaking don't need to be transitioned. For example, there was some emergency assistance for things like replacing equipment that had previously been provided and that Ukraine had been sustaining, but that were damaged during the war. Also, there were other types of emergency assistance like backup generators and things like that. The training work is largely complete, and so the Department of Energy considers that to have been transitioned. At the time the training finishes, Ukraine is able to conduct a response if one was needed. But other types of things that need to transition are newer equipment provision, like remote sensing equipment, like other kinds of monitors that have been installed. And really, that can't happen until there's a more secure situation on the ground.
We also looked at how the money that Congress appropriated is being used in Ukraine. It seems like addressing fraud risk might be even more difficult in a war zone. What do we know about the fraud risks here?
It absolutely is more difficult in a war zone. In the case of the Department of Energy spending here, a lot of this money is going out on contracts and then subcontracts for work on the ground in a hostile environment and where we really don't have U.S. officials on the ground to confirm that work has been completed to the terms of the contract. So that absolutely creates a heightened risk of fraud. In addition, with the supplemental funds that the Congress appropriated, those funds had to move really quickly, much more quickly than the department might otherwise normally operate. And so that too creates additional risk of fraud.
So what's being done to address these risks?
Well, many of the Department of Energy's contracting officers who were responsible for executing the contracts to do this work did take steps to assess the risk of fraud, and in some cases either determined that the mitigations that they had in place were already sufficient, or in a handful of cases developed additional mitigations or controls against the potential for fraud risk.
So Allison just told us that efforts to improve safety and security at Ukrainian nuclear sites are increasingly difficult because of the war. And it's also increasingly difficult to address fraud risks facing U.S. assistance. So Allison, what more do we think needs to be done to address potential fraud issues?
So while individual contracting officers in some cases did do that look to evaluate whether the fraud controls that were in place were sufficient for the conditions on the ground, this wasn't something that DOE actually required of its contracting officers. And therefore, there wasn't really a consistent approach across DOE's programs that were executing this work or the contracts that they put in place. And that is not consistent with the department's own guidance for enterprise risk management. So we recommended that in cases like this, where there's a heightened risk of fraud, either because money has to move quickly or because there's a changing operating environment on the ground, that the department should require fraud risk assessments of its contracting officers.
And what about these plans to transition responsibilities to Ukrainians? What do we recommend there?
We recommended that the department really formalize its transition agreements with its Ukrainian counterparts so that there is a shared set of expectations around what readiness looks like for the Ukrainian partners to assume responsibility for this equipment or these functions, and that would really help protect the U.S. investment.
And last question, what's the bottom line of this report?
The risk environment in the Ukraine is really substantial with respect to nuclear and radiological security. And the United States, especially the Department of Energy, have been providing significant support to Ukraine in that area. But that's also why we think implementing our recommendations is important to ensure against the potential for fraud and to also transition the U.S. investment when Ukrainian partners are ready.
That was Allison Bawden talking about our new report on Ukrainian nuclear security and safety. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to the Watchdog Report. To hear more podcasts, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And make sure to leave a rating and review to let others know about the work we're doing. For more from the Congressional Watchdog, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, visit us at gao.gov.